the premier website for green building, I might add, and executive editor of Environmental Building News, and he is going to introduce Bill McKibben.
Thanks, Philip, and thank you all for being here. This has been just a wonderful event, and it's been very exciting to be part not only of planning it and figuring out who we might get to present here, but to participate in it and meet all of the amazing people that have shown up for this. So I'm hoping we'll make this a regular event. We're still going to be talking about that, but thank you all for coming. It's thrilling this afternoon to introduce my friend Bill McKibben. Bill doesn't need much of an introduction. He's probably the best known, certainly the best known environmental journalist in the country. Boston Globe called him the nation's leading environmentalist. Time magazine described him as the world's best green journalist. And when we began planning this conference and talking about who we might try to attract to Brattleboro, to this fledgling venue, Bill was at the top of our list. And many of us on the organizing committee had read his book, his wonderful book, Deep Economy. And if any of you haven't read that, you definitely should. In that book, he articulates many of the ideas that really are embodied in this event. So it's a great book, and thrilling to have Bill here to close out the event. Bill is a scholar in residence at Middlebury College, and most people today know him as the founder and leader of 350.org. So please join me in welcoming Bill McKibben.
Thank you so much. No one I'd rather have introduced me, nobody who better combines practical know-how to an almost scary extent and deep emotional commitment to doing the right thing. So thank you, Alex. I'm in such a good mood because I'm just crossed the Vermont border after week after week on the road organizing, and it puts me in a very good mood to be getting close to home. And I was a little resentful about coming indoors on what's the prettiest day of the year until I got in here. It's like it's like just like a pizzeria owner on an acid trip. It's really fantastic. I never knew it was here. I'm so happy to go. I don't have to come back and go to the movie. It wouldn't matter what the movie was. It's fantastic. Look, I'm so sorry to have missed everything that's gone on here these last days. And I hope that much of it has been, I know that it's mostly been very practical and down to earth and moving things ahead, but I hope that at least a little bit of it has been celebratory. And I want to just sort of start in that vein. Because I think it's important really to recognize just how far we've come, how quickly. And if you look at something like food, you get a pretty good sense. Now, 10 years ago, I taught a little course at Middlebury on local food production, and I think it was the first course of its kind at any college in the country, partly because there was absolutely nothing to assign anyone to read. Only 20 years of Wendell Berry essays. That was it, you know? The great prophet who never gave up, and thank heaven has lived long enough to see his vision really start to come to pass. Because now you cannot graduate from college in this country without having read Michael Pollan in 2 or 3 classes, you know. It's fantastic to see. In fact, Middlebury, every year we graduate at least 15 or 20 kids who, having spent $200,000 pursuing their education, now really wish to grow garlic someplace, you know. That's, and I try to stay away from their parents at commencement, but I'm inordinately glad to see it. They're some of the best students there, and they're going out and changing the world in really profound and beautiful ways. Partly because they're farming, and partly because they're doing it in a whole new spirit, embracing the kind of farming that requires having lots of people, not a few people, in a farming community, requires working together to build a kind of critical mass. It's wonderful to see. I remember 6 or 7 years ago doing a piece, a very off-the-wall piece that I proposed because it was an experiment I wanted to do, and I proposed it to Gourmet magazine, or because Ruth Reichel asked me to write something for him. I said, okay, I will. And the result of that was that for a year, my family, we ate nothing that wasn't grown in the Champlain Valley. And at the time, people were completely struck by this as if it was the oddest thing on earth, you know. Well, 2 or 3 years later, localvore was the word of the year, you know, in the, suddenly, you know, all kinds of people. What was hard 6 or 7 years ago has become progressively easier, thanks to the work you all. Now you can do it, you know, without hardly even having to think that you're doing it. If you know, just shop at the co-op, especially now that we're going to have Vermont frozen food. That's almost cheating. That make it so easy, you know. Here's the bottom line on this. It's no longer a kind of fringe thing, a sort of experiment. Last year, the USDA said that for the first time in 150 years, there were more farms in America, not fewer. There's nobody in this room, nobody's parents, nobody's grandparents, nobody's great-grandparents who have ever lived in an America where the number of farms is increasing instead of decreasing. That's as significant an indicator as I can think of, almost, for a kind of real turnaround. And of course, all that growth is coming at the small end of the scale, with people learning to grow food for their neighbors. In Vermont, you know, the number of dairies continues to decline. We dropped below the 1,000 dairy level a few weeks ago in Vermont, with a few more really sad foreclosures. But the number of farms in this state keeps growing and growing and growing because people are figuring out that there are other things than milk that we can produce pretty much everything that we need. I was able to do that experiment because I'm not a coffee drinker, but I am a beer drinker, and one of the reasons that it was possible, one of the reasons I agreed to even contemplate it, was that in the Champlain Valley, our neighbor Ben Gleason had been growing wheat for 20 years down in the valley just fine, and Otter Creek Brewing started making wheat beer with this. I figured I would just hole up with enough cases of that. Even if nothing else worked, I'd be fine. But now, you know, now Vermont, among other things, leads the world, I think, in breweries per capita, something to be very proud of. And if we can figure out how to build a good malting plant here, so we're not importing the barley malt, we'll be well ahead. You can tell I've got my eye on the important ball at all times. Now, it would not be, I would not be fulfilling my my destiny if I didn't also bring you a good dose of gloom at the same time. I am sort of a professional bummer outer of people. That's kind of been my role for a long time. And so I will going to talk for a minute about the really serious trouble that we're in globally, because I want to get back to connecting this up to the local. I want us to understand how crucially these two scales intersect, because it's the degree to which we understand how those scales intersect that will allow us to continue making progress locally, or not. Our first book about climate change, a book called The End of Nature, 22 years ago. And we knew most of what we needed to know 22 years ago. We knew that when you burn coal, gas, oil, you put carbon in the atmosphere. We knew the molecular structure of carbon traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. The only thing we didn't know was how fast it was going to pinch. Being human, we hoped it would take a while, so it would be somebody else's problem to deal with. The story of the last 20 years is that it's pinching very much harder and very much faster than we had imagined. My last book, a book with the odd title, Earth Spelled Wrong, E-A-A-R-T-H, was a kind of effort to say, look, we're already seeing at very large scale changes on this Earth. We have left the Holocene and the 10,000 years of benign stability that marked the rise of human civilization and entered into something else. I'm not going to talk about the book. I'll say in the year since, you know, that case I think has been demonstrated to anyone paying the slightest bit of attention. 2010 was the warmest year for which we have records. 19 nations set new all-time temperature records. Some of those were pretty off the charts. We were talking with our 350 crew in Pakistan one day in June. One of them said, this was just about a year ago, said, very hot here today. And I was surprised to hear him say it because it's normally hot in June in Pakistan and you wouldn't mention it. He said, no, it's really hot here today. We just set the new all-time Asia temperature record. It's 129 degrees. I said, okay, that's hot. And when you have heat like that, bad things happen. You know, the Arctic melted again for the 4th year in a row. We set new records. For much of the summer, the northwest and northeast passages were both wide open, and people were having a yacht race through territory no one thought a human would ever be able to navigate even 5 or 6 years ago. You saw the pictures from Russia of their incredible drought and fires, and you saw the pictures from Pakistan of the almost unbelievable sort of biblical scale flood that went on there. One of the things, maybe the most important physical fact of this century, is going to turn out to be that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. The atmosphere is about 4% moister than it was 40 years ago. That's a very large change in a basic physical parameter of the Earth, almost unbelievably large. What it means is that in arid areas you're getting more evaporation and more drought. And once that stuff is up in the air, it's going to come down. And when it comes down, it increasingly comes down. You load the dice for deluge and downpour and flood. And country after country is throwing snake eyes in this dice game. And maybe last year, I mean, we saw them every place. Queensland, in Australia, Vietnam, Philippines. The president of Colombia said last week that they'd had so much rain that they'd essentially washed away in roads and bridges 25 years worth of development in that country. The most affecting pictures were probably the ones from Pakistan. There's a region up in the Khyber Pass that normally gets 3 feet of rain in a year, and at the end of last July, it got 12 feet of rain in a week. And the result was that Indus, which spreads out across the center of the country, covered about a quarter of Pakistan before it was done. A couple of months ago, the Red Cross said there were still 4 million homeless people in Pakistan as a result. So, what is that, Gay? 7 times the population of Vermont or something like that, you know, homeless. You can see it, you know, right this second in our nation. You go to Texas, we've so far burned more of America by this date, by the 1st of June, than any year in our history, most of it in Texas, where they're in the middle of a wild drought, worse than the depths of the Dust Bowl. There's significant parts of Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico that haven't had a significant rain since July. You move, you know, 500 miles to the east into the middle of the Mississippi River Basin, and they have more water than they have ever had pouring down the Mississippi. And you move further east than that, and of course we've had wild storms, more thunderstorms recorded in a single day than any day in history, more tornado deaths so far this year, including, tragically, our neighbors just a little bit to the south on the day before yesterday. You can measure, maybe most powerfully, the extent of the kind of changes we're seeing in the last few years just by looking at a few basic indicators, maybe the most basic of which is the price of food. When the Russians had their big drought, they cut off all grain export to the rest of the world. They turned around ships and trains and sent them back to the silos and granaries, which was bad news because Russia's the third biggest grain exporter in the world. And so the price of stuff went up sharply overnight, and it's kept going up because obviously the harvest failed in Australia. We didn't get a winter wheat crop really out of Texas this year. Across the Midwest, people are having the devil of the time, just as they are in Vermont, getting tractors in the field to plant anything. It's been so wet. There's a record drought across the Yangtze Basin in China. And another one across Germany and France, the kind of heart of Western Europe's wheat belt at the moment. And so the price of grain is about 80% up. It's at absolute record levels, and that means that there are a couple of billion people tonight who are, eating less than they would like to be because they can't afford it. When the price of grain goes up, we feel it some, but, the price of a box of Captain Crunch or something goes up, a nickel or a dime, because basically you're paying for the box, not the corn in it, But if you're buying cornmeal and making tortillas, if the price of corn goes up 80%, the price of dinner goes up 80%. And if you don't have much money, then the size of your dinner goes down, and that's what's going on. So here's the thing that I want you to remember, and I need to get across, okay, the one real piece of science. So far, we've increased the temperature of the planet about 1 degree. We've put enough coal, burned enough coal and gas and oil, put enough carbon in the air to increase the quantity of the sun's energy that we're trapping in this envelope of atmosphere by about 3/4 of a watt per square meter. Okay. Not an enormous amount, but as it turns out, the Earth was a finely balanced place, and that 1 degree has been enough to cause the changes that I described. Now, there is another degree of warming, we think, basically already in the pipeline from carbon we've already emitted. The heat gets stored for a while in the oceans, but expresses itself back out into the atmosphere over decades. So we're at 1 degree, and that's been enough to melt the Arctic. We're probably going to see 2 degrees or pretty close to it. The question is, what's going to happen after that? The climatologists are very clear, very robust in their confidence that unless we get off coal and gas and oil far quicker than any government is planning to at the moment, the number will be, before the century's end, 4 or 5 degrees. Okay? If 1 degree is enough extra energy to melt the Arctic, we do not want to find out what 4 degrees will do, because every prediction we can make about it is incredibly grim. Think of what havoc the extra energy, that 3/4 of a watt per square meter, is causing in terms of rain and evaporation, and the ocean is 30% more acid already because it is absorbing excess carbon, and on and on and on. Then try to figure out what happens when you quadruple or quintuple that quanta of energy. Think of the havoc that's then caused. We can predict a lot about what will happen. And at its most basic level, it looks like it won't be livable with. The agronomist, there have been a bunch of studies in recent months from agronomists around the world, at Stanford, at the University of Washington, in Europe, in Asia. And their basic convergence is around the idea that for each degree Celsius increase in temperature you get, grain yields fall about 10%. Because grain, is just as evolved to deal with the Holocene as we are, maybe more so since it has roots, We're at its optimum growing condition, and it can't tolerate extra heat. That calculation, by the way, is just from what happens with heat, just by taking it out of its ideal temperature ranges. It doesn't even begin to take into account what's going on with hydrology and water. The reason I'm telling you all this is to make the case that those of us who are committed to the future have to be able to work at both the local and the national/global level if we're serious about making change. Another way to say that is, you can build, and many of you are, the best local, say, food systems that you can imagine in the whole world, with dedicated, skilled, organic farmers who know what they're doing and are taking enormous care of their land and are building beautiful farmers markets and networks of restaurants and co-ops and everything else that deal with it. That is magnificent. And it's magnificent for many reasons. It's, ecologically much sounder, obviously, to have a 5-mile tomato, not a 2,000-mile tomato. It's culinarily sounder. I traveled 2,000 miles this week. I know how I feel. That's how the tomato feels also. But it's also important because it's more resilient. It can deal with a wider range of conditions. But there are limits to that resiliency. If we set up a world where the temperature is 4 or 5 degrees higher, it won't make much difference. If it rains 30 days in a row, then it doesn't matter how great your food system is, you still don't grow anything. Or if it doesn't rain for 30 days. And those are the conditions that we're all but guaranteeing as we move down this road. Look at Vermont this spring. Try to imagine that that kind of rainfall and things becomes normal, and then, many years we have it much tougher than that. And then try to imagine what you're going to do as field after field washes away, as the roads and bridges we need to get back and forth to each other wash away. If we cannot deal with this problem globally and nationally, if we can't staunch that flow of carbon in the atmosphere, then we can't deal locally either. So that's the end of all the depressing stuff. Having said that, I want to explain how I think it's possible we can do this work and do it both locally and globally at the same time. That's why we started this thing, 350.org, 3 years ago. We started it because, we started it in the wake of a paper by our greatest climatologist, Jim Hansen, the NASA scientist who's really responsible for an awful lot of our knowledge about atmospheric change. Jim and his team at NASA put out a paper saying that we knew enough now about climate to know how much carbon was too much. So any value for carbon in the atmosphere greater than 350 parts per million was, as they put it, not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. Okay? That's strong language, direct language, practical language for scientists to use, straighter than they often talk. And it's straighter and scarier if you know that outside today, in Brattleboro and in Barcelona and in Beijing, it's 394 parts per million and going up about 2 parts per million per year. Okay. We're way above where we should be. And so that was a scary paper, but because we were trying to figure out how to organize, we thought it was in certain ways a asset for us too. We finally had a number to work with. And the good thing about numbers was that it seemed to offer a route into dealing with the biggest challenge of global organizing, which is that everyone around the world insists on speaking their own language, making it very difficult to reach them all with one message. So we decided to just take that number as message. And there were people who said, oh, that's too hard, no one will understand it. It's too much science and whatever. And we didn't know. But our sense was that people were pretty practical. and that they understood pretty easily the concept of numbers. The analogy that was in my mind was, you know, if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, your cholesterol level is too high, you're over the limit, you're in the place where people have heart attacks, then you pay attention, you know. Very few people insist that the doctor give them an entire dissertation on the lipid system at that point, and only a complete crank goes home to the internet and sort of searches for some website to tell them that cholesterol doesn't exist, or, you know, whatever it is. And then you just get with the program and do what you need to do, all right? And so we set out around the world, beginning in Vermont, but quickly out around the world to try to organize, and we set a date for when we wanted to have this first big day of action to try and drive this number into global consciousness. And we didn't know how well it would work because we had no resources. It was just, you know, sort of the core me and 7 students at Middlebury. But, you know, 7 students, 7 continents, it matched up pretty well. The guy who did the Antarctic also had to do the internet. And October 24th, 2009, if you want to show a couple of those slides now, if you have them up there, I mean, it actually turned out to work pretty well. There were, on that weekend, 5,100 demonstrations in 180 countries. CNN said it was the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. So there, slow down for a minute there, actually go back one. The very first, 2 days early, we got this call from, on October 22nd, from our organizer in Ethiopia, a wonderful 17-year-old girl. She said she was in tears. She said the government took away our permit. We can't do the thing we were going to do on Saturday. We're having to do it today, so we don't, you know, they can't shut us down, but we're really sorry, and we don't mean to jump the gun, and we don't want to spoil it for everybody, and we were so looking forward to doing it the same day as everybody else. And there are 15,000 kids right now out in the street in Addis Ababa. And so we were, you know, don't worry about the date, it's okay. And then after that, they just rolled in. The next one was Afghanistan, as you saw, U.S. soldiers, 350 with sandbags that were park our Humvee for the weekend and walk. You want to just flip through some of these here pretty fast, because the main thing I want to get across as you're looking at them is this. There are an awful lot of brothers and sisters that you have all over the world. The trope that environmentalism is something for rich white people who have taken care of their other problems turns out not to be true. There are, you know, most of the people we work with are poor, black, brown, Asian, young, because that's actually what most of the world is made up of. And oddly enough, they're just as interested in the future as anybody else, maybe more so, because the future is pressing down on them pretty hard. You can flip through these. Hopefully they didn't stop for too long, those guys. Stop 1 second, go back. One of the things that was nicest, most interesting to me, was we got huge involvement from religious communities around the world. So that was South Africa. There's the head of Muslim South Africa, the head of indigenous native traditions. Behind him, Archbishop Tutu's successor is Anglican Archbishop of South Africa, at the head of a huge multi-faith march. Okay, you can skip through a few more. That was Billy Graham's alma mater. That's the Holy Land. I'd been to Bethlehem to organize, hard even to get there, but the Dead Sea is shrinking very fast as temperatures rise. So because there were too many military checkpoints in the way, the Jordanians said, we'll do the 3 on our shore. The Palestinians said, we'll do the 5 in Palestine. The Israelis said, we're good for the 0, you know. It was really nice. You can flip through some of these here. Lots of kind of global Scrabble playing and, you know, involving, and just, you know, beautiful stuff happening. And of course, Vermont was remarkably overrepresented in this whole thing. It was all beautiful and powerful. Keep going. Stop for 1 second. That's one of my favorite pictures. It's Soweto, heartland of resistance to apartheid, they did 350 bungee jumps, but they strung the line between the cooling towers of a defunct coal-fired power plant. And just sent us a note saying, this is the best use of coal-fired power plants going forward. That's my daughter in there someplace at the mountain school in Chapel. 300 big demonstrations across China. Not an easy place to do this, but you know, one of them got busted up by the police. Most of them worked really well. That's the China Youth Climate Network making a human, no, keep going, making a human wind turbine, and behind them, if you look closely, you can see the largest wind farm in the world there in Inner Mongolia. A place just as beautiful as Vermont, by the way, but the windmills are powerful there, and good to see. Keep going. Maybe just flip through these a little faster here. Stop them there for 1 second. That's the Maldive Islands, complete paradise. 1,200 islands strung out across the Indian Ocean. White sand, palm trees, coral reefs, beyond beautiful. Highest point in the whole archipelago is about 1.5 meters above sea level. They've been there for 5,000 years, but the chances that they'll last out the century at this point are small. They're trying very, very hard in every kind of symbolic way. They're, you know, that's the Student Government Association holding a meeting in the lagoon that day. The president, it's an entirely Muslim nation. The president, Mohammed Nasheed, taught his whole cabinet how to scuba dive. They held an underwater cabinet meeting to sign a 350 resolution. They have announced that they will become the first carbon neutral nation on the planet. They're building windmills as fast as they possibly can, not frankly because their carbon emissions are enough to make the slightest difference in how all of this comes out, but because they understand that there are useful ways of try to shame the rest of the world into doing what it should do. At the same time, they're realists and they put aside money in their national budget each year, though they are poor, to buy a new homeland someday. No one knows where, because we don't, not a lot of sort of spare real estate in Asia, but that's what they do. Go on. Just flip through. It was, we got great news coverage, I think in part because, keep going here, so many of the people didn't look like what people thought, stop there for a second, go back one, people thought environmentalists should look like. So there's the oil-rich sheikhdom of Abu Dhabi. But the oil-rich sheikhs are getting with the program, you know. Behind them is the edge of the world's largest solar array. The UN, they've just won the rights for the UN's Renewable Energy Lab will be in Masdar City there in Abu Dhabi. Go on. Just amazing pictures. Stop there for a second. Actually, just stop there. We'll stop there. There were 600 or 700 pictures in a file that would just labeled 350 adorable, you know. And they really were adorable, and they really are haunting. In 1911, nobody could look at anybody and say, you're going to be a refugee in 40 years. But now we can't. I mean, unless we get our act together, that's exactly what we're looking at a world that's just impossible for billions of people to live on. The first civilization scale threat that we face. So, the question is, you know, what to do. And I think that the answer is suggested by the pictures that you're seeing, which is we have to build an effective mass movement that can demand action in time. So far we haven't gotten there. It's only a kind of beta test, you know. 6 weeks after this big demonstration was that Copenhagen Climate Conference. In certain ways, it was very good. We got 117 nations to sign on to this 350 target. That was impressive, considering that it just sort of started in Addison County and spread quickly, you know. We got 117 nations, but they were the wrong 117 nations. They were all the poorest and most vulnerable ones, and the addicts, led by us, you know, not ready to do a thing. And so the place fizzled. And 6 months later, the U.S. Senate refused to even take a vote on climate change, on the most tepid, tame, moderate bill you could possibly imagine. Refused to even take a vote, you know. I was worried that would just kill this whole infant movement in the cradle. It would be so disappointing. But last October 10th, we had another one of these big global days, and a lot of you participated in this one, and it was on the 10-10-10, and we called it the Global Work Party, and we stressed the practical. People put up solar panels on community centers, they dug big community gardens, they laid out bike paths, they did all those kind of things, and at the end of the day, they put down the hammer and picked up the cell phone and called, whatever they had, Prime Minister, President, Politburo, said, look, we're getting to work, what about you, That day, there were 7,400 of these gatherings in every country on earth except North Korea. That's who your brothers and sisters are in this work all over the place. And if you want to look at more pictures like this, there are 30,000 or so of them on Flickr, in our Flickr account. If you want to page through them, and if you get despairing, do someday, just because they're powerful. But don't mostly look at pictures. Mostly figure out how we're going to keep building this thing bigger. I'm going to talk about 3 things that we're doing that we need your help with. And the first is mostly about making it bigger. And it'll be beautiful, and you can do it completely locally. It'll happen on September 24th. I would say circle it in your calendar, except I know you no longer own a calendar. You have to input it into your device somehow. September 24th, we're calling this day Moving Planet. And all over the world, people will be focused on how we get around. And much of the day will be devoted to bicycles, because they're part of the solution, because they are beautiful and will be a great way to deliver demands to our leaders instead of marching on Montpelier, 1,000 bicycles circling it will be a good thing. And because bicycles are one of the few tools used by both rich and poor around the world, and hence one of those places to keep showing this kind of solidarity back and forth. So, September 24th. Second, we need to make this more than just informational. We need to be a little aggressive, too. Because we're not just losing because our leaders don't understand the problem. Increasingly, they understand it. They're just not taking action because the power of the fossil fuel industry, especially its financial power, is enough to prevent that action. All right? This is the most profitable industry on Earth. And they're more than willing to use that money to accomplish their ends. So we're taking on, and we need your help taking on, their chief front group in this country, which is called the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Right? It's not your local Chamber of Commerce. Chances are your local Chamber of Commerce is just fine. Our local Chamber of Commerce runs the Chili Festival. We like them. They do good stuff. Okay? The U.S. Chamber of Commerce sounds like it's the same, but it's entirely different. They claim to represent all of American business, but 55% of their funding came from 16 companies last year. Now, they won't say who those 16 companies are, and thanks to the U.S. Supreme Court, they don't have to, but it's pretty easy to figure out because their legislative agenda, could be summed up as, how fast can we make this planet warm up? Let's find out. They oppose every possible thing that might do any good at all, and they do it in the strongest possible terms. They filed a brief with the EPA last year saying, don't take action on climate change because, among other things, if the planet warms, humans will be able to adapt their behavior and physiology to cope with a warmer world. All right? Not that their 16 companies might be willing to adapt their business plan so they could use wind and sun, but the rest of us should change our anatomy in some way, unspecified, in order to deal with this issue. If someone on the streets of Brattleboro, offered this as their plan for how to deal with climate change, you would avoid them. Actually, in the streets of Brattleboro, it might, sort of fit right in sometimes. But you would avoid them some, you would think this is great. But if you have $200 million in campaign contributions in your back pocket, what's clearly crazy becomes completely mainstream insane. We can't take away that money, but we can take away some of that credibility. And so the campaign, and it's very easy, in fact, completely, it's the only way you can do it is to be very involved at a local level. We're getting local businesses and local chambers of commerce to say, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce doesn't speak for me. If you have a farm, if you have a business, if you have a magazine, if you have anything in the world, you can join this campaign. If you don't have one of those things, but you happen to shop at a business of any kind, you can make sure they do, and you can be in touch with the people who run your local Chamber of Commerce and say, we need you to differentiate yourselves from these guys, to stop lending them your support, even if it's passive. And so that'll be good campaign. If you go to 350.org, you can find out about it and you can join in, and it will make a difference, and it will do it while at the same time you're strengthening the kind of local green business networks and things. I was in Bellingham, Washington 2 nights ago. Bellingham's one of the great homes of this kind of slow-living local business sort of thing. It's where Ballet was born, and it's probably the most put-together local economy thing in the world. And hence, I was actually kind of happy when it turned out that the people who were running the biggest coal mine in North America in the Powder River Basin decided that the place where they wanted to build the port to ship that coal off to China so it could be burnt as fast as possible was the harbor right next to Bellingham, and that's where all the trains are going to go through. And I wasn't happy for them. They, karmically, they don't deserve it, but I was happy because I was pretty sure they would figure out the links between local and global and stand up and do something about it. And indeed, 2 nights ago I was speaking on the Village Green, and there were 1,000 people there. They said it was the largest gathering they'd ever had in Bellingham, and they're all completely fired up and ready to go to work. Most of us aren't going to get a threat that's quite that immediate, an opportunity quite that obvious. But we all have to figure out through things like I'm talking about here, September 24th, this chamber campaign, how to intervene, how to make a stand in our communities that has a global resonance. Okay? And if you want to go a little further, if you feel like you have a few days off from doing things locally, if you're willing to travel a little bit, maybe, I'll make just one more little suggestion. We're going to be doing some more serious civil disobedience around climate as the next few months go on. The main target we're going to go after, we're going to be in Washington, because there's a huge new project called the Keystone Pipeline that runs from the tar sands in Alberta down to Texas. They can get all that sludge out of there and refine it. There is a lot of that sludge up there. If you could burn all the tar sands tomorrow, you could somehow set it all on fire tomorrow and burn it all off at once, the atmospheric concentration of carbon would rise 200 parts per million overnight. It would go from its current 394 to about 600 parts per million. Okay? This is one of those places we should never go near. The job of the Canadian and, well, the job of North American government should be to safeguard it, just like we're hoping that the Brazilians will safeguard the Amazon, okay? Keep that carbon underground. But instead, the President and the Secretary of State have to decide this year whether or not to grant what they call a certificate of national interest, that it's in the national interest to build this pipeline down, to lay this new 1,500-mile fuse to this giant carbon bomb, And so we're going to be in Washington trying to persuade them otherwise in the most peaceful, straight-ahead ways that we can. We've done some experimenting with civil disobedience in this climate movement. 2 years ago, Wendell Berry and I put out a letter asking people to come to Washington to sit in outside the coal-fired power plant that provides the juice for Congress. And lots of people, somewhat to our surprise, showed up, 3,000 or 4,000 people, so many that the police said, we can't arrest you, there's way too many. Which was fine because Congress, having seen all these people, had already agreed to stop burning coal in that plant. So, one down, 600 to go. But it was good first attempt like that. We're going to do it again, as I say, And if you want to find out more about it, go to a website called climatedirectaction.org and leave your name, and we will get in touch with you as the summer wears on. One thing I will say, and I've said all along, is if we're going to do this, we're not going to make college kids the prime cannon fodder this time around. It makes far more sense for those of us who spend our lives pouring carbon into the atmosphere to do this. We can deal with, I mean, I'm looking around this room and seeing many contemporaries. We can deal with an arrest record more easily. What are they going to do to us? I mean, at this point, you know, not that much. And more to the point, one of the things we have to get across is that in this fight, in all of these fights, from working locally to build food networks to this kind of work, one of the things we have to get across in this is that we are the conservatives. All right? The people who are changing the composition of the atmosphere in fundamental ways are radicals. In fact, no one has ever proposed anything more radical in human history than doubling the carbon content of the atmosphere and just seeing what happens. That's radical, it's insane. And it falls to the rest of us to be, in some sense, very deep conservatives, to try to hold on to a world that looks something like the one we were born into and that we know works. And one of the ways to get that across is to have not just young people, but old people out there on the firing line. Since we're right on the, not far from the border, I was thinking, as I often do when I drive through this part of the world, of my old friend that some of you must have known, Doris Haddock, Granny D. A great friend, a woman, if you don't know her, who walked across America at the age of 90 to protest this kind of stuff. And a couple of years later, she called and said, "Come to Washington, we're going to do a protest at the Capitol." And you know, I knew it was probably a little early and wasn't the most practical, wasn't really going to have that much effect and whatever, but you know, I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher. If some 93-year-old person tells me to do something, I normally do it. And so, you know, off I went, and we held this sign, "Stop global warming, stop campaign contributions from global warmers." And we were we were in the rotunda of the Capitol, which is closer than they wish you to do the free speech thing. And so they arrested us, and they handcuffed the two of us together, which was very funny because she was like about 4'8". So, and she looked up at me, and she had emphysema, which made the whole Walk Across America thing even more insane. And she looked up and she said, "You know, 93 years old. Never been arrested before. Should have started long ago." So, I don't know. You don't need to get arrested if you don't want to, if you don't feel called to, but you do need to be really powerfully involved. And I know that every one of you is powerfully involved at the local level, doing amazing things. And those are things that, as I said at the beginning of this talk, bring enormous pleasure to me. And they're really the only things that I really want to work on. If it were up to me, I'd spend my whole time in Vermont working on the incredibly exciting things that are underway here and around the Northeast and around the country on all these kind of local initiatives. But I spend almost no time in Vermont anymore because I've come to understand that if we don't also figure out how we do these global things, that it won't matter. We've got to be able to do both. We've set up this 350 thing to allow you to do things close to home that also have strong global resonance. We need you to do them. Were I a real organizer, a good organizer, I would end by sort of, just end there, you know. I'm a writer by trade, and so I'm kind of constrained to tell the truth. And the truth is, we don't know if this stuff's going to work. We don't know if anything's going to work. There are scientists who think we may have waited too long to get started. If you were a betting person, you might bet that the odds are against us because we've been losing for 20 years on this climate stuff. But that's not a bet you're allowed to make. You know, to be morally awake when the worst thing that ever happened is underway means getting out of bed in the morning and trying to figure out how to change the odds some. And you change the odds some by doing beautiful farming and building co-ops and doing efficiency work around homes and communities. And you change the odds a lot in those ways, but you also have to figure out how to change them politically and at the highest levels. And these two things are completely intertwined, and if you're only doing one of them, then you're only doing half, I'm afraid, what we're called to be doing right now. No guarantee we're going to win, but I can tell you, from having been all over the world, spewing carbon behind me, that there are lots of rooms like this one, filled with all kinds of people who are ready to go to work, who are in fact completely insistent on fighting until the last possible minute. It is wonderful to be in their company always, a great honor, especially in those places, those parts of the world where they haven't caused any of the problem to begin with. I don't think if I lived in Bangladesh, I'd be as big-hearted as to kind of want to participate in some big global coalition with a lot of people from the West. I think I'd be so pissed off at the West that I'd just, but there they are. Always a great honor to be in those rooms. An equally great honor to be in this one and just to be able to say thank you to you all for the really important work that you've done and that you'll do and that we'll do together, and it'll be a great pleasure to be side by side with you in the years ahead. Thank you. Yes, we've got a few minutes to do questions and things. I've rattled on a ways, and I know that there's some other business to be done before 4:15. But if there's people got a little bit of questions or comment or abuse or anything, I'm happy to. There you are.
What do you think about chemtrails, HARP, the new Madrid fault line, and all of that? I've just been kind of made aware of it recently, and it's terrified me. I love the fact that you gave hope at the end.
So the question is, what do I think about chemtrails and the new Madrid fault line? I don't know that much about any of them. My sense is the things that we have most to worry about aren't esoteric in any way, or hard to see, or hidden, or anything else. The thing that we mostly have to worry about is incredibly obvious. And that's the very mundane, straight-ahead, day in, day out burning of fossil fuel, which is pouring carbon into the atmosphere. You can talk for a long time about other possible worries. One of the great problems of global warming is that it's forced us to triage to an inordinate degree and to focus on this at the expense of focusing on a lot of other environmental problems which are very real. But if we don't solve this one, then everything else we do is moot. If temperature warms 4 or 5 degrees, it makes very little difference. There are a number of other things we won't have to worry about anymore, which I guess is the upside of climate change. So that's where I do my best to focus on the thing that seems absolutely key at the center of things. And to me, that's the thing to be fought against, and the thing to be fought for are local economies that provide the absolute vision of where we're going next. And if we can get over this hump of rising temperature, then that place we're going next is extremely beautiful. It's really going to work. We've shown that it's possible already in the last 10 years of this local food revolution, and it's not just food now. There are lots of other parts that are feeding in, and the interesting thing is how they all seem to come in the same sort of form. We're moving, we could move, hopefully we will move, from a world of very centralized institutions to a world of much more decentralized ones. The farmer's market is a great example. The farmer's market means everybody, lots of people bringing things and lots of people taking things away. It's sort of the opposite of the big industrial food stream. It's more like the internet, which is people bringing information and taking information out, not like the big three TV networks spewing things at you. The same thing is happening in energy. We're clearly going to go, if we're at all smart, on a path from big centralized energy production that made sense in an era of fossil fuels, which after all are very concentrated, to an era of what the engineers call distributed generation, which takes advantage of the fact that sun and wind are omnipresent but diffuse, you know? And those will be much more beautiful democratic institutions in every way. And that's why it's so important to build them, and it's why it's so important to defeat this force that can keep us from getting there. And it's a force of centralization. The fossil fuel industry, which stands in the way, doesn't want us to do it because it likes the current business model, okay? Its business model is, I get to use the atmosphere as an open sewer for free into which to dump my products. And all the fight that's going on at essence is about the for free part. Because if we ever charged them for the damage that they were doing, then fossil fuels would be uncompetitive and out of the game overnight. And everyone would be putting solar panels up and whatever it was. So that's the key. That's where the fight is. And that's why it's such a titanic fight, because these guys have so much money. Exxon made more money last year than any company in the history of money, okay? They've got so much money, they're always going to outspend us. We need a different currency. And if it isn't bodies and spirit and creativity, then I don't know what it's going to be.
I understand that President Obama just signed off how many acres of Wyoming to coal?
Yes. Yes, it's a sad but true. President Obama did 6 weeks ago sign over 750 million tons of coal underneath federal land in Wyoming for mining, all right? And that's why they want to build this coal port in Bellingham, so they have a place to ship all that coal over to China. Because oddly, American environmentalists have done a pretty good job over the last 5 years in beating back new coal-fired power plants. So the market for it is no longer as strong here as they thought it was going to be, so they're going to have to get it out to China. And it was too bad that the president did that, and it'll be triple too bad if he signs off that permit on this Keystone pipeline down out of the tar sands to Texas later this year. He's the one who's got to put his signature on it. You can be sure there's big pressure on him to do it, just as there was big. We got to make sure there's some pressure back. I got to say, I like President Obama. I was one of the first names on the environmentalists for Obama list, but he said early in his tenure, you've got to make me do things. You've got to pressure me to do things if I'm going to get them done. And I take him at his word. And so we will try to pressure him, and we'll try to pressure him hard, and sometimes over little things. We did last fall, one of our kind of little projects at 350 that was kind of fun was we asked leaders all over the world to put solar panels up on their residences. Okay? And many of them jumped right to it. Mohammed Nasheed from the Maldives strapped on his tool belt and went up on his roof and put in solar panels in the Maldives. That was really good. The White House, the most visible piece of real estate in the planet. And so, of course, we were particularly hopeful that that would happen there. But we weren't getting any love at all from the White House. And so we found on the top of a college, I'd gotten an honorary degree from Unity College in Maine years ago. So I knew that on their cafeteria, they had the hot water panels that Jimmy Carter had put on the White House in 1978, and that Ronald Reagan had taken down in 1985 because he wanted, you know, manlier forms of energy than that. And we found, we borrowed one from Unity, and we took it on a back of a biodiesel-powered van down the East Coast, and we had big rallies in Washington and New York and Boston. And we finally, when we got to we had a meeting at the White House with, you know, the third undersecretary in charge of pretending to listen to you about things, got no. But 2 weeks later, because we'd kind of put as much pressure on them as they could, the White House said, "Okay, we'll put solar panels up again, and we'll do it next spring." So, by my watch, that's 18 days to go. If you're signed up on the 350.org website, I think you'll see in the next week or so a kind of beginning escalation of reminders that time grows short for getting these solar panels up on the roof. It's not a big deal like the Keystone Pipeline is, but it's a way to make the point that we're paying attention to what this guy does. Being better than George Bush on energy stuff is good, and he definitely is, but it's not that hard. I said one time I was having sort of debate, one of the Obama guys said, "Yeah, we're much better than George Bush." I said, "That's true, but I've drunk more beer than my 12-year-old niece, too, I mean, it's really not that great So we got to keep pressing them hard to get where we need to go.
Hi. A couple of days ago, the 21-tower wind farm was approved in Lowell. The Lowell town voted unanimously for it, and now all the other towns are lining up lawyers and lawsuits to try to derail it before it can happen, so it loses its federal subsidy. And I always find that the opposition, it sounds like you're building a condo on the top. It's not a condo. So in terms of the world global view, can you speak to that one right here?
Well, this is so hard, of course, these questions of wind towers in Vermont and where to build them, and partly it's hard because we've carefully all learned over the last 50 years from, a great succession of environmentalists to love the places that we live. And there's really nothing shameful about a kind of NIMBY attitude in certain ways. I mean, we need to take care of our backyards, and that's a noble thing to do. But there are times when you got to think about what that means. I don't know about the Lowell project, and I don't know all the particulars. I've never been up there to look at it. I know that in the places the two places that are closest to my heart where I've lived, one's in the Adirondacks in northern Warren County, and the other in Addison County up in Ripton. We've worked hard to try to get big wind towers put up in both places. There's an active proposal in Barton Mines in the Adirondacks, and we have a testing tower, I think, up now at the Snow Bowl, the ski area up on the ridgeline above where we live in Ripton. And I'm very hopeful that I'm almost certain that the testing tower will show that there's wind, because they put one up last year and it blew over before it could get enough data, which I take as a good sign. I'm a kind of amateur at this business, but I'm very hopeful that both places, not because, I understand that there's problems, and there are no perfect answers to any of these questions, and there are places where you shouldn't put up wind turbines because they do too much damage, and there's too much wilderness, or you're right on top of somebody's house or whatever. But this I will say, whatever the problems that are caused, the same people who are getting the power are suffering the problems. All right, that's an advantage, as opposed to saying, let's burn some coal and let the people in West Virginia have their mountaintops removed, and let people in Bangladesh watch the ocean sort of rise over their farm, okay, and get none of the best case scenario is we build wind and solar stuff as locally as possible and on as small a scale as possible, not just because it does less damage, but because it builds out this distributed grid in profound ways. But, we have to work pretty fast to get an awful lot of change done. And since it's probably a good thing that we're closing down Yankee, given the fact that, given the fact that it's a bad sign when large pieces of your nuclear power plant keep falling off the side, given that, it's all the more onus on us to figure out how we're going to deliver energy that we use in a way that doesn't wreck our lives or people's lives elsewhere.
This
And of course, the big,
20,000 homes. These 21 towers, $20,000 homes and
good.
$500,000 to the town.
it's good. The other place that we don't mention, and we need to, and always should be talking about, is the kind of stuff that, you know, Alex reminds us every month in his magazine. We can use an awful lot less energy than we do too. And to the degree we do that, it helps along the way as well. So I'm afraid we're going to have to do all of it, and none of it's, you know, as you can tell, there's no, none of this is incredibly easy, and there's no ideal solution to whatever, but I think we can be pretty confident that if, as we make this transition, we're moving in a much more beautiful direction than the one we've been in for the last while. And I am extraordinarily looking forward to seeing sort of how it all comes out. Like Wendell Berry, I'd like to live long enough to get to see some of the things that I've written about and hoped about really take flesh. And I'm extraordinarily glad that y'all are doing so much of that work. And if we figure out how to work effectively together on this largest level, there's some chance it will all mean as much as it should mean. So thank you guys so much.
To end our session, I'd like to invite Lisa Hanau to help us with a little gratitude closure.
Lisa, Lori, you know, I answer to a few different names. And I love that the Bill, when he got up to speak, mentioned celebration, asked us if we were celebrating. And I know that there have been a number of ways in which we've been celebrating our time here, but we thought it would also be honoring to the whole community if we closed with gratitude. Because gratitude allows us to celebrate the present and to appreciate the endeavor that we have been engaged in this case, of course, the summit, and to amplify the good, and to close in participation collectively. And so I'd just like to ask if anyone has any gratitude that they'd like to share aloud into the community right now. We'll take a few. And please, you can, if you want to share from the back, just give a good shout out when you're sharing, or come up and use the mic right here if you prefer to do that. And so, any gratitude for the experience that you've been in over the last 2.5 days.
Yes. I just want to say, thank you, everyone, for putting your heart and soul into this meeting and into this space so that we can all look forward to living in our community. Did you ever hear me? Can you hear me?
So, one more time. Give a large shout out now.
I just want to say thank you to everyone for bringing your hearts and your souls, because this isn't really about money. It's about creating community, and also for sharing all of the wonderful things you're doing here. And for me, it was very, very affirming, and I'm sure that everyone felt that way too. So thank you very much, and pat yourself on the back, because it was great.
Yes, Bill.
I just have two thanks to extend. One to all of my colleagues at the Marlborough College Graduate Center for taking on so many tasks, especially the last couple of days, to make this all happen. Everybody really chipped in. And then I'd also like to express my personal gratitude as one of the members of the steering committee to Orly Munzing, and also to Martin Langeveld, and to Philip, who joined us, and also to everybody else who's part of the Strolling of the Heifers effort because without the strolling of the Heifers as an existing organization and movement, this just wouldn't have been possible, and it wouldn't have had anywhere near the flavor as an event that it had. So thank you, Heifers, from my heart.
Who else? Yes.
I'm going to show. I really want to appreciate the spark of creativity that happens when I'm listening to somebody tell me their story, and it gives me a new idea for my story. And I write it down, and I'm taking home a whole list of good new ideas, not repetition, but something that happened in the space between us, the inspiration that got shared. Thank you.
And thank you. And do I see a hand up here?
Well, okay, I didn't have my hand up, but
Thanks, Phil. Come on.
yeah, I want to give thanks to the next generation, and for me, that was spending this morning away from. I snuck away, and I spent time with the goddaughter that I share with Terry Molnar. Terry Molnar and I are godfathers for Zoe Humphreys, who's the daughter of Lester Humphreys, who's done a lot of work on this, on organizing this. And so when I come up to Brattleboro, one of the things that I do is I connect with Zoe, who's 3 years old, and it represents in some ways what I do my work for, which is the next generation that's coming up. And I think from what Bill has said, our current generation is not gifting. We're gifting a really, most likely not the same earth to this next generation. And so my gratitude is to that next generation's courage to step into the earth that they're inheriting. And I give thanks that they're there to remind us of something so vital that we need to work
Hi, I'd like to thank participants in advance for sending feedback to us on what we did well, what we could have done better, and what we can do better if we repeat this event or something like it. So you'll be getting a survey by email or some mechanism. Please take the time to give us your thoughtful feedback, because we want to make this event better. We want to figure out how to effect change in a broader way. So thank you in advance for that.
We'll take one more. If there's any burning gratitude to be shared.
Thanks. I'd like to express extreme gratitude to all the volunteers. We heard about that they've been necessary for this event, and I can't imagine. But also to get the work of the volunteers to produce what it can produce takes incredible organizing, and I am super, super impressed with how this whole event has been coordinated and organized, and the whole strolling of the Heifers. I'm very, very grateful to live here and to get a chance to be a part of this. So thank you very much, and also to all the volunteers.
And actually, if I can just riff a little bit off of what you just articulated, and having the total blessing of being a part of the faculty in the Marlboro MBA program, as a community builder, I happened to be on some group emails with the Marlboro students who were volunteering here and to see the respect and the excitement and the care with which they organized themselves and reached out to the other students at SIT and UVM, and the joy that they've had in showing up here as servant leaders has just been so heartening. And so thank you so much for what you brought forward. And just thank you all so much for your presence here. I know that there's much more at play over the next couple of days, but what a beginning. What a beginning for a first summit. And so my best to you all as you continue to journey on, and may you continue to show up in the good, the true, and the beautiful that I've been so privileged to be a part of here over the last 2.5 days. Thank you.